reading forum. All right, things are flashing on my screen here. And by 8:55, we will end the first session, reading in the open forum, with a 15 or 5 to 10-minute break before we proceed to the next session. At 9 a.m., we will be graced by our first speaker. Okay. The talk will go for about 40 minutes, followed by a 20-minute Q&A. Second session, both the talk and the Q&A will end by 10:20 or so. This will be followed by a 10-minute break. By 10:30, we will have a third and last session for the morning. The same protocol follows: a 40-minute talk followed by a 20-minute Q&A or open forum. And the third session, both talk and the Q&A will end by 12 noon and followed by an hour of lunch break. That's 12 to 1. Afternoon sessions will begin by 1 p.m. All right, before we begin with our first activity, let me encourage, number one, the speakers to stick to their allotted time, all right, more or less, you know, the time given to you to give your talk. Second, to the audience and the participants of the conference, if issues and questions surface from the depths of either your suke or your cranium as you listen to our speakers, do note them down and send it through chat, okay? And I'll do my best to bring them before the speakers. Or you could wait and raise your hand later during the open forum to ask your questions yourself. But let me hasten to add that time for the Q&A is limited, so apologies in advance if I cannot get to all your questions. However, you have the privilege, I was informed that you can directly send a chat even after the open forum. You can still send your questions to the speaker, and I hope the speaker will be able to engage you and give a personal response. All right, let me just remind everyone to follow the KISS rule, the KISS rule in asking questions or making comments. KISS stands for keep it short and straight, a principle that I may have shamelessly violated yesterday. Apologies, my bad. All right. Okay, we're ready for our first event, I hope, I trust, okay, for our first session. Alrighty, for our first session, we will be listening to a reading by Veniz Maja Guzman. He's a board member of the Philosophical Association of the Philippines, and the paper is titled Challenging the CEAP, or the Catholic Educational Association of the Philippines. Arguments against SBN 1334, a case of testimonial injustice. All right, so Veniz, you have the floor.
Starting share screen will stop other participants' computer sound share. You want to continue? Okay, yeah. Okay, so. Okay, there you go. All right. Okay, so hello everyone. Okay, so I want to begin this by saying that this paper is a work in progress. So Doc Gina Opiniano and I are both writing this paper. And I also want to say that I actually have work at 9. So I'm going to try my best to make this quick. But if you ever have any questions, and I trust that you will, because again, this paper is a work in progress, then you can just email me at veniz.guzman@gmail.com, or you can direct your questions later at Doc Gina, since she's going to be here later. Okay, so now I'm gonna start. So our flow is there. So I'm gonna discuss a bit of an introduction, and then the CEAP argument against SBN 1334, which is also the Prevention of Adolescent Pregnancy Act. And then I'm going to discuss epistemic and testimonial injustice, and lastly, how the CEAP arguments are rooted in testimonial injustice against adolescents. Okay, so policies concerning sexual and reproductive health and rights, or SRHR, in the Philippines have a long history of facing opposition, mainly from religious groups. So the most renowned issue regarding this would be the infamous Reproductive Health Bill, which took 14 years of debates and deliberations before its successful passage into Republic Act number 10354, or the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Act of 2012. The threat of passage of the RH bill itself turned the country into a religious battleground, with Catholic and Christian institutions turning against each other when their respective members gave their support. So the Catholic Church threatened to also excommunicate its members who supported the bill, and there were calls for expulsion of professionals in Catholic academic institutions who supported this bill. So, however, even after the passage of the bill, it was deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court after facing numerous petitions by several Catholic groups, and was only upheld 2 years later in 2014. So the teenage pregnancy rate in the Philippines was 10% in 2008. It went down to 9% in 2017. Live births by teenage mothers, however, in 2016 totaled 200,085, which slightly increased in 2018. So still, the Philippines has one of the highest adolescent birth rates among the ASEAN member states. Recent World Bank data shows that the Philippines has 47 births annually per 1,000 women aged 15 to 19, which is higher than the average adolescent birth rates of 44, globally, and 33.5 in the ASEAN region. So this entails that more than 500 Filipino adolescent girls are getting pregnant and giving birth every day. So that is a huge number. Okay, so Senate Bill number 1334, or again, the Prevention of Adolescent Pregnancy Act, had been repeatedly facing opposition and was finally delayed in the Senate last September 2020 after the Catholic Educational Association of the Philippines, or the CEAP, raised strong objections for several reasons. Aside from not being consulted in its creation, the CEAP also objected to the mandated Comprehensive Sexuality Education, or CSE, provisions of the bill, pointing out that the addition of CSE is already part of other reproductive health laws. Although there is news that CSE will be implemented in some regions in the Philippines, deliberations for the Senate bill are still halted and the CEP objections still hold. So research has repeatedly shown that there is a wealth of positive effects that come from mandating CSE, as countries that have included the program in its schools show lower incidence of unwanted pregnancies, sexual violence, and other forms of gender-based violence. In that sense, in a country where adolescent pregnancy is considered to be a national emergency according to the Population Commission, it is baffling that the urgency of the issue is not stressed in the Senate and the appropriate measures passed as quickly as possible. In addition to that, the CEP also raised concerns regarding access to reproductive health services by adolescents, a provision similar to the one in the Responsible Parenthood and Reproductive Health Law of 2012. And this was actually struck down by the Supreme Court, as the parents of these adolescents are deemed to still be the ones who need to give consent regarding the use of contraceptives. In the Senate bill, adolescents would be able to access the said services in public, private, and even school clinics, and Catholic institutions argue that this is in conflict with Catholic ideals of sexual morality. So as incidents of adolescent pregnancy continue to soar in the country, these measures and policies need to be put in place immediately. I do not aim to argue that policies concerning SRH are for or against Catholic ideals. If you can hear my cat, I'm so sorry. Okay, so, but I aim to argue that the reasons for the deliberate withholding of these policies due to provisions I have mentioned above are rooted in epistemic injustice. Specifically, it is a testimonial injustice as it gives a credibility deficit to an entire demographic, adolescents. The lack of SRHR policies have been argued as an injustice in other fronts, but I wish to argue for it from the lens of epistemology. Okay, so let's look at the CEAP arguments. So again, these are the ones that were quoted by Senator Vicente Soto III, or Tito Soto, who is the current Senate President of the Philippines. So he was actually the one who read this position paper during the deliberations of the bill. So these are the three arguments that he mentioned, and these are the ones that they were deemed to be crucial in the withholding of the passage of the bill, or the delaying of the passage of the bill. So the first argument is that the CEAP objected to the provision in the bill that mandates to include a standardized age and development appropriate comprehensive sexual education in schools and communities. According to their paper, the Catholic identity is ingrained in the vision, mission, and policies of the schools, making a standardized instruction on human sexuality unacceptable. So next is they also oppose the provision which would allow adolescents to avail themselves of RH services in public and private clinics, including school clinics. So according to their position paper, not only does this provide a certain level of concern for member Catholic schools to implement this, which cannot be at the same time harmonized with basic Catholic principles on human sexuality, but more importantly, it already conflicts, if not overreaches.
Excuse me.
Oh, yes.
Excuse me, Veniz. Your slides. Okay, your slide is frozen. It's not moving.
Oh, really?
So perhaps you can. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's more. It's yeah. We can follow you more. Your thoughts if we have the slides. So yeah. Okay. Thank you. Apologize for the interruption.
It's okay. It's okay. I'll stop share and I'll reshare. Can you see it? There. Is it?
Yep,
is
it's
it
there.
working? Okay, there you go. Okay, so again, so for the second argument, so basically the CEAP does not agree that adolescents should be able to avail of reproductive health services in school clinics because according to them, so this is not in harmony with basic Catholic principles on human sexuality, but more importantly, it already conflicts, if not overreaches, as it already includes yun nga, mga school clinics and school-linked health centers, and likewise, it excludes the participation of the minor's parents in decision making. So for the third argument, so they also argued that Section 13 of the bill, which talks about how discriminatory and exclusionary practices that harm and discourage the education of adolescent parents shall be prohibited, is problematic as there's vagueness in what those terms mean and to what extent it is being harmful and discouraging to the education of adolescent parents. So according to the CEAP, it should not be used as a shield when students violate other provisions in the handbook. So for example, if a student gets pregnant, like an adolescent student gets pregnant under scandalous circumstances, like they should not be able to use that as a shield from punishment, like from being expelled from school, for example. So the CEAP has a couple of proposals, but there is one that I want to highlight. So this is to give parents more participatory power by letting the adolescent secure a written consent from the parent when the said adolescent seeks to access modern family planning methods. So I want to note that according to the bill, these adolescents are ones who are already like sexually active or presently sexually active. So like instead of giving them like the chance to protect themselves, the CEP is saying that no, they have to ask their parents first for consent to be able to avail of these services. Okay, so let us move on to a discussion on epistemic injustice and testimonial injustice. So epistemic injustice, according to Miranda Fricker, is an injustice that harms an individual or demographic specifically in their capacities as knowers. And there are actually multiple kinds of epistemic injustice, such as, for example, if you're going to expel a student from school because they practice bodily autonomy. So that is one such instance. But there are two main instances that are usually highlighted. One is hermeneutical injustice and the other is testimonial injustice. So there is actually a plethora of examples to choose from when it comes to instances of epistemic injustices. So for example, women have been routinely disbelieved when they report their experiences of sexual violence. genderqueer and non-heterosexual peoples have been questioned regarding their knowledge of their own identities. The knowledge of women and BIPOC professionals have been questioned despite having been conferred their relevant degrees and other untoward incidents in which the knowledge of the individual or group is considered to be less credible. There are okay, so these are only a few of the examples. So there are various kinds of, again, epistemic injustices that can be committed, such as hermeneutical injustice, which I mentioned earlier, in which non-dominant demographics or those who are marginally situated lack the epistemic resources to make sense of their own experiences, as those who are dominantly situated are the ones who have the power and influence to develop the epistemic resources that are appropriate to their own situations. Okay, so now that again, this paper is a work in progress, and now that I'm seeing it, it actually seems like I also need to include a discussion, like a deeper discussion on hermeneutical injustice in this paper and not just testimonial injustice. Because in this paper, again, I just went more in depth on testimonial injustice. Okay, so in hermeneutical injustice, for example, so certain social experiences can lack the name or language needed to understand them due to a gap in collective epistemic resources born out of structural identity prejudice. So again, what I was originally concerned with is testimonial injustice, which is the other kind of epistemic injustice. So, okay, there we go. So central to the discussion of testimonial injustice is testimony. So when we talk about testimony, especially credible testimony, the main concern usually is what conditions are supposed to exist for the listener to justifiably believe or to know what the speaker is saying. So this means that even if the speaker is giving correct and factual information, we will have trouble believing or simply reject the speaker if we do not have the correct conditions surrounding that. So hence, aside from the information that we're getting from the speaker, we're also forming what we call as credibility judgments about the speaker. Okay, so, but before we go any further, so what is testimony? So there is surprisingly a wide array of definitions for testimonies. We're gonna go with the most basic one, which is testimony is defined as the intentional transfer of a belief from one agent to another, according to Duncan Pritchard. So there is a variety of questions that arise from the topic of testimony, such as if testimony is a reliable source of belief or if it can be a basic source of knowledge, what actually is considered to be testimony, and of course, what are the conditions that must be met for a speaker's testimony to be considered acceptable. So what we're focusing on the problems that arise from the last question. So there is a judgment formulation that takes place before we can accept what a speaker is saying. So Rachel McKinnon identified the 4 primary sources of information we use to formulate these judgments as seen in Sanford Goldberg's writings. So first is the speaker's track record, such as if they have a reputation for lying or providing erroneous information. Second is their demeanor in speaking, such as if they look nervous or unsure of what they're saying. Third is the listener's background knowledge on the topic, such as if they're an expert on the subject and they know that the speaker isn't. And lastly are the structural features of the assertion, such as, like, was it a tabloid piece, a gossip piece, or was it a news interview? So we process these things implicitly. That is why some of us automatically know that we're not supposed to just trust or believe everything that we see or hear, no matter how credible they might seem. However, just because there are these identified conditions, it does not mean that these are the only conditions that we implicitly process, okay, when we judge the credibility of a speaker. So Miranda Fricker argues that identity power is an integral part of testimony because of the need for hearers to use social stereotypes as heuristics in their spontaneous assessments of their interlocutor's credibility. So identity power is a form of social power that requires not only practical social coordination, but also an imaginative social coordination. So whenever our exercise of power depends on this imaginative social coordination, aka our shared imagined conception of social identity, such as, for example, adolescents should not be trusted to make decisions regarding their own bodies, then identity power is at work. So it is important to note that the practice of identity power, it does not actually need to be active. So for example, a cishet male doctor questioning a woman's testimony regarding her own health, that's an active application of identity power because he is appealing to the shared imagined conception of social identity that women are sensitive, they are overreacting, and they are prone to hysterics. As I mentioned, it doesn't always need to be active. So let's say that the same doctor is being consulted by a cishet couple because a wife is experiencing pains. The men are talking, the doctor is talking to the husband, and they address each other, but they don't acknowledge the woman, the wife, and all the questions are directed towards the husband, but not the woman. So they don't need to put her down or correct her, they just need to not acknowledge her. They don't need to have a current beliefs about this either, meaning the belief that women should be infantilized does not need to be at the forefront of their minds because what is being appealed again is the collective social imagination of their identities. So let's take this back to testimony and credibility. So there are instances in which certain demographics are systematically believed or disbelieved, demographics whose testimonies are systematically getting dismissed, meaning there are people whom we tend to automatically judge as more or less credible than others. Miranda Fricker identifies these two issues as credibility excess and credibility deficit. So credibility excess is when the speaker or the demographic is judged to be more credible than they really are. And credibility deficit is when we judge a speaker or an entire demographic to be less credible than they really are. So having a credibility deficit because you're part of the disadvantaged group, say you are an Asian transgender woman, so we call this as testimonial injustice. In this case, the speaker experiences harm as their capacity and credibility as a knower is undermined by the audience due to identity prejudice. So there are plenty of examples regarding this one. So we have no shortage of women, for example, who were disbelieved, mocked, and harassed when they came forward with their stories of sexual violence. We have stories of women being dismissed by healthcare professionals as overreacting, therefore not getting the care they need. We have stories of LGBTQ plus folks being sent to conversion therapy or church camps or just being told that they are invalid. We have stories of people from the lower classes being thrown in jail despite their innocence because it was someone from the upper class who complained against them. We have stories of people of color being arrested, even killed, despite them claiming their innocence simply because it was a white person or an entity such as like a store, for example, like Walmart. It's their word against theirs. So again, there are plenty of examples available. So we have to pose the question, however, are all instances of credibility deficit a case of testimonial injustice? So the answer is no. So for example, if I start discussing about physics, like you're not going to believe me because that is not what I study. So in that case, although you don't believe me, that is not a case of testimonial injustice. So going back to our definition, a person experiences testimonial injustice when their credibility or capacity as a knower is undermined due to systemic identity prejudice. So the kind of testimonial injustice that Fricker and that we are concerned with is a kind that is deeply intertwined with other injustices called systemic injustices. So I have to point out here that Fricker uses the word systematic, so I also have to use that as well. So, and I quote, so systematic testimonial injustices then are produced not by prejudice simpliciter, but specifically by those prejudices that track the subject through different dimensions of social activity: economic, educational, professional, sexual, legal, political, religious, and so on. So being subject to a tracker prejudice renders one susceptible not only to testimonial injustice, but to a gamut of different injustices. And so when such a prejudice generates a testimonial injustice, that injustice is systematically connected with other kinds of actual or potential injustice. So Fricker gives a good example of testimonial injustice born out of prejudice, but is not systematic. So for example, philosophers of science tend to get dismissed as out of touch academics, hence acquiring credibility deficit from, let's say, like both the scientific and non-scientific communities. So there's prejudice present there and testimonial injustice, but it is not systematic. So this is very different from, let's say, a person from faith minority is talking about their understanding of faith, acquiring a credibility deficit simply because of their identity. So for lack of a better example, Christians who dismiss the validity of minority religions because it does not fit their worldview. So that is a systematic testimonial injustice. So lastly, it is important to see in our examples that credibility deficit and excess tends to go hand in hand. Let's say a child reports an abusive parent and the authorities side with the parent because they deem the child's knowledge of the incident to be untrustworthy. So the child experienced a credibility deficit and the parent was given a credibility excess. So the poor and people of color have been arrested despite their innocence and given a credibility deficit, and the people who complained against them, usually people with more identity power, so those were given a credibility excess. So Fricker points out that credibility excesses and deficits do not exist within a distributive model of justice, meaning credibility is it's not the finite good. She states that the hearer's obligation is obvious. She must match the level of credibility she attributes to her interlocutor to the evidence that he is offering the truth. However, just because that is the case, it does not mean that there is no direct relationship between credibility excess and credibility deficit, as we have seen in our examples. So there's also testimonial injustice that is directed towards adolescents. So children have been discussed as bearers of epistemic injustice as they are seen to be typically less credible than their adult counterparts. So this is
Hello, Veniz.
yes.
I'm sorry. We're trying to keep to the schedule. All right. So maybe you have 2 minutes to wrap things up, and we can proceed to the next session. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
We're tight. Our schedule today is tight, so yeah. Please wrap things up. Thank you.
All right. Okay. So how do I go about this? Okay, so there are cases in which so just because what do you call this? Okay, so this is not to say that children and adolescents should like always be considered equal in footing to adults, and that their decisions are given equal weight in all matters. However, we have to understand that there are legitimate cases in which this inequality has actually led to dangerous situations for adolescents, such as child abuse, ill health, and even death. So there are stories of, for example, like children complaining about their health and medical practitioners misdiagnosing them because they don't believe them, and so they end up dead. So there are also those children who speak up about stories of abuse against their own parents or other authority figures, and they are not believed. So those are evident in our country, actually. So those happen a lot in our country. And so another telling example is the dismissal of adolescents in their knowledge, like when discussing politics, for example. So they're told by elders that they know nothing or that they haven't lived through what their elders have lived through. So we can actually see that today. So therefore, their knowledge and capacity for knowledge is discounted. So however, you mustn't forget three important things. First, adolescents are capable of knowledge. Second, and so they should be treated as such. Second, adolescents do have access to information and they will act based on the information that is available to them, just like the rest of us. And third, adolescents have the right to bodily autonomy and self-determination. So according to the Population Commission, adolescent pregnancies are often not a result of deliberate choice, but a result of restrictive policies, sex without consent, harmful social norms, and the lack of information. So denial of the adolescent's right to self-determination is a testimonial injustice, as it denies their capacity for making informed decisions about themselves and their bodies. Okay, there. So again, work in progress. But there are three reasons why I see that the CEAP arguments are rooted in testimonial injustice. Okay, so you can just read them here. Okay.
All right. Okay. So you have this. You have the screen there, the slide. Just keep it up. All right.
Okay. Sorry. Can I just speak for a quick bit? I actually have to head on to work because it's 9:03.
Okay.
Okay. So
all right. So you will not be able to entertain questions, one or two.
see, Doc Gina is here and she is the one who is going to be entertaining the questions. But as I mentioned earlier, you can also email me if you have any. So that's
All right.
veniz.guzman@gmail.com. So I will send this slide to the link.